This is the discussion for Euthyphro, the Socratic Dialogue by Plato. The format will always be, we'll read a work for education purposes, and then I will provide contextualization and discussion afterwards. In the future, I'd like to have a more integrated, responsive feedback where we can actually have a conversation and I can take questions, and I'd like to even do that in a live format at some point. But for now, we're just going to start with our discussion of Euthyphro. Now, Euthyphro takes place around 400 BC. It's actually 399 BC, when Socrates, at the age of 70, is brought up on charges. Now, it's important to take an anthropological perspective to understanding this work and all of these ancient philosophical works. It's important to contextualize it. For while they are extremely useful in illustrating beginning points of critical inquiry and philosophical thinking, they also have built into them, you could say, layers of complexity, but there's a performative aspect to them. And so familiarity with stories and culture are paramount to understanding the work. And you probably know most of them, but I'm going to go over a lot of it. To start off with, Socrates was said to have lived and died in Athens. Now, all of the Greek city-states had a state religion, and that was the pantheon of Greek gods, at the top of which was Zeus. You've probably heard some of the stories, but all of these stories were required liturgy. And Athens is very unique in a lot of ways. And it has a lot to do with its religion. Now, it has been said that there was freedom of religion in that you could believe whatever you wanted, as long as you believed in the Greek gods as well, which may be true to a point, but you can't believe in another king of the gods if Zeus is king of the gods. What I was saying about the theology and the culture and the impressive state of Athens, there is a surviving play called Oresteia. That's how I pronounce it. I probably butchered it. But in this collection of 3 plays, which is one of the very few, if only, surviving collections of plays like this, and it won, I think, we know it won an award, I think 50 years, somewhere around there, after about 400 BC. So or maybe it was 450 BC. So about 50 years before or after this. And these plays won an award. The play is about justice, natural justice, and an actual principled justice. It's not really unnatural justice. It's more like law justice. In this play, there's a murder that happens. The typical response in these situations is you kill somebody else of their house. And this case gets heard in a court of law in which Apollo acts as the first lawyer. And so, having a state religion and having a pantheon as that religion, and being a renowned democracy and having courts and having the society that they did, deities would take on paragons of value, would become paragons of values. And the messy part of that is sometimes they're contradictory values. So, about 600 BC, so about 200 years before this, we get the man who we get the word draconic from. Athens goes from having most of the people who live there being the property of the oligarchical or aristocratic classes to being a state of democracy where they import most of their slave labor now, and citizenship, duties, and privileges are granted to a large number of property holders. Male heads of family. Still very limited. Now I have the Peloponnesian War is going on in the background here, and Socrates, at his trial, cites his military service in the Peloponnesian Wars. And so Socrates has some political bent, and we assume that in this uncertain time for Athenian democracy, because it went through several dismissals and reinstantiations, it's pretty clear that Socrates and Plato were not happy with the state of the democracy. And I'm going to leave further political conjecture out of it, because this is really just the beginning of the material, and we can get into more of that later. But as for more backdrop, Plato's writings of Socrates, which I will get into in just a moment, why, if you don't know why that's such a contentious and strange way to put it, I'll get to it. There were other philosophers before Socrates and Plato, obviously. Or maybe not obviously, but there certainly were, and not just from other cultures. There were other Grecian, other Athenian ones. What had happened before was known as a sophistry, or it was the era of the sophists. Now, I've described a state of political upheaval with classism, and Athens itself was somewhat of a city on a hill with the raised upper portions in the middle of it, and then several other hills which had important places of either civic power or cultural importance. And then you had lower end places that were also lower in altitude. And you have people developing reason and I don't even really want to say political theory, but the philosophers before Socrates have a mystic quality to them. They are intuiting or divining truths given natures of accepted cultural norms. And it may sound like a weird way to say it, but they'd write poems and plays to deities or about deities as a way of expressing, you could say, cultural values. And there were schools at the time of Socrates' trial. It's actually an important backdrop. And in a moment, I'll get to why we pick up this. This will make sense as to why we pick up the story here, as Socrates is on his way to his trial. There were schools that were teaching people rhetoric. Sophistry had become a way of saying what sounded good, of rationalizing attempts to climb hierarchies, is what it seems like. If Socrates hated the sophists, this would be the reason, is he thought it was a corruptive influence. And it wasn't serving truth. It wasn't helping people grow in their relationship to knowledge. It was kind of a politically expedient way to argue. So that's the backdrop where we now meet this character Socrates in this work by Plato, who is on his way to his trial, or for some sort of preliminary hearing for his trial. His charge, listed as impiety in Euthyphro, is actually corruption of the youth of Athens. And he is found guilty, and he is encouraged to flee, and he chooses not to flee. Instead, he chooses to stay and accept his punishment, and which is to drink hemlock, a poison, which he does. No writings of Socrates have survived. So now we're getting to the point of the character Socrates and why we always mention Socrates and Plato in the same breath. There's only two students who represent Socrates' philosophy, and the most prominent of which is Plato. The rest of the Platonic dialogues are students of Socrates or Socrates himself espousing the philosophy of Plato, who develops his mentor's teachings. there is actually more historical evidence for Jesus Christ than there is for Socrates. More sources from direct students, and more sources from non-related parties. And I say that just to give you an idea of how deep the Socratic question is, or the Socratic problem is, which is, we don't even know that Socrates existed. There's plenty of literature about it, but other than a few mentions by other peoples and a play which characterizes Socrates as somewhat of a dirty hippie, there's really no corroborating evidence for his existence. So I refer to Socrates, the character. And we see within the first few, the early works of Plato, as they're called, are considered Socratic philosophy. And then the later writings are considered Platonic philosophy, where he now is putting his philosophy in the mouth of the character Socrates, which expounds upon Socrates' original teachings. Nothing of Socrates is written down. I do believe there's a reference to something Socrates did write down by a quote-unquote contemporary. But I've been learning about these things for a long time, and that information has unfortunately slipped away from me. But it was somebody responding to, or just giving a call out to, Socrates. And as you'll see as we read Socrates, then they'll just drop a name, which has a grand reference. So Socrates, we meet in the Euthyphro on his way for his preliminary hearing. And we're introduced to the Socratic method, where Socrates does not offer so much his own theories or his own truth as he does question others. He personifies a wisdom and a knowledge of one's own ignorance. Socrates seeks to draw out explanations from the people he's conversing with, and then eliminate implausible theories or explanations to somehow arrive at what the truth is. It's a proof by contradictions or a proof by elimination. And again, he's not really putting forth any arguments, but of course he is, because it is performative. There's a great theatrical aspect to this. He's not just asking questions randomly. He sort of baits people into, he'll stroke their ego a little bit, and this is just the way that it's written, so of course it works out well for him. Well, not too well. But nobody ever gets so mad that they punch him in the face, although they do sentence him to death, so there's always that. He wryly questions the people he's engaged in dialogue with in a way that gets them to expose their ignorance while claiming to be ignorant himself. So that's sort of what the Socratic method is. It's purposeful questioning to eliminate theories that are incorrect. Now, because it is performative, because we know of the culture and religion of Athens, because this heavily influenced their law and their again culture, we can see arise very quickly three problems, and these continue to be addressed, and what eventually gets fleshed out is a questioning of these presuppositions of the state religion and its laws and its governance and its democracy. There comes the question of epistemology, ontology, and universals. Epistemology is how do we know things? What do we know? This is the study of knowledge. And so, as the first philosopher and the first person to put this down in rationalized form, we see the question arise, well, what do we know? How do we know it? And can you tell somebody about it? And then how do we question that to make sure that it's airtight? Ontology is the question of what exists. And again, you see how this comes into play with the issue of the gods. The gods are spoken of as if they are real people and exist and do things. But we would say that they don't exist. And later on, whenever we get into the forms, we'll really be into the arena of ontology, but I don't want to get too far ahead of myself. And then finally, after what do we know, how do we know it, and what exists, and how do we know it exists, you get to the problem of universals, which is a dichotomy between universality and the particular, which again will be bantered back and forth throughout the ages. But Plato, through his character Socrates, really hits home on this. So now we're going to actually examine the Euthyphro, now that we have a little bit more understanding that I didn't want to get into in the reading. It's a little bit of history about Athens, the Greek city-state, and Socrates and Plato. So, with our first work, and this is the first work of Plato, ostensibly, the Euthyphro, we are introduced to this character who is tragically doomed to die for doing, as I have just explained, the opposite of what he was accused of doing. He was upset at sophistry and these schools where they were asking people, the rich nobles' children, for they were charging them to come and learn rhetorical skills for the manipulation of civic authority, essentially. And that's at least certainly one way to characterize it. And so we can see the tragic irony of Socrates' story is that he never charged anybody, and all he did was go around and ask people questions, and he taught people how to do this, think critically, as a means of fighting the corruption of the state, of the people, of the society. So the performative aspect right there is very open. And we start off with Euthyphro saying, "What's new, Socrates, to make you leave the Lyceum, where you usually spend your time?" And the Lyceum is the gymnasium. So, right off the bat, we know that Socrates is a gym rat. And that's where he spends all of his time. He's just chilling at the gym. How you gonna bro dog with your bro dog if you don't bro dog? I mean, right? And later on, I'll make plenty of more jokes about why Socrates spends most of his time at the testosterone-laden, oiled workouts of the gymnasium. But this is, of course, also where the public baths were, and a lot of people spent most of their free time, and where most people congregated and just socialized. But we also know that Socrates was a gym rat. So, the first thing, and I believe there's still a performative aspect to this. Euthyphro, why aren't you at the gym, Socrates? And why are you here? Surely you don't have a lawsuit. And Socrates' first word, Athenians. Again, we know how important Athens is. We know how important his questioning, his critical thinking is to the fabric of Athenian civilization, Athenian governance, Athenian religion. Athenians. Don't call it a lawsuit, Euthyphro, but an indictment. It's a very powerful sentence. Because, as you said, an indictment is something that one citizen makes against another. It's very different from probably the legal tradition that he's talking about. Now, Euthyphro, again, for a little bit of background, he's somewhat of a prophet. He claims to prophesy. And he's a very religious man. He's an interpreter of the will of the gods. And he asks Socrates why he's there, and Socrates lets him know that someone's brought suit against him. Someone is making a charge against him. And it's somewhat of a young politician who's concerned that he's corrupting the youth. And Socrates, in classic fashion, praises this guy. He says it's very smart of him to be looking out for the youth, just playing up his good intentions. So that's not really the purpose of the dialogue, but it does tell us a little bit about the background. Now, Euthyphro explains why he is in court, or going to court, and we start to get our first, or the real main issue of the dialogue, which is piety. And what is pious? Euthyphro, this prophet, is there to indict his father for murder, because they had a day laborer, a slave of some kind, who murdered somebody else. And his father tied the guy up for murdering somebody, restrained him, tied him up, and threw him in a ditch, and then told the authorities. And while the authorities were getting back to him about what to do about the guy who had murdered somebody, the murderer, the guy had died. And so Euthyphro, in an actually stunning and daring and very courageous act of virtue and morality, has said it doesn't matter what my relation to the person is, and it doesn't matter if the guy he killed was a murderer. He still murdered him. Now, this is actually getting into individualism. The idea that everybody has unique and everyone has the spark of God in them, is a way of saying it. Everyone has something intrinsically valuable about themselves that has to be respected. We very much appreciate that today in most of the civilized world where people have rights or documents guaranteeing protections of rights. We have, at this stage in civilization, specifically Western civilization, already developed and incorporated this individualism, but it's quite foreign here for this man to have a concept of justice that is superordinate to his concept of familial obligations. It is a huge moral abstraction, and I think a correct one, for Euthyphro to do this. So we see him right away as somebody who's quite honorable and doing the right thing, but Socrates, nonetheless, digs into this guy a little bit. And he's already been mocked because of he'll perform these prophecies, these, I suppose, visions. And he says that he predicts the future for them, and none of them have ever failed to come true. And they just... They ridicule him, they scorn him, they don't take him seriously. And even now, he's actually undertaking quite, like I said, a noble and courageous act. Because it can't be easy to do that. His family's pretty upset with him for doing this too, because, what do you care about this guy? He was a murderer, he's not your family, and he was a slave. And did we mention a murderer? And so, it was right for him to die. But, again, this is theatrical, because we have already the development of a justice beyond natural justice. And I'll just leave it there, because we could really get into an eye for an eye, the avenged sevenfold nature of Cain in the Bible. There's a lot of spiritual documents, and specifically, as we're talking about society and its principles, the Epic of Gilgamesh is actually quite great on this, and we'll get to that later. But not in this philosophical series, obviously. Also mentioned by Euthyphro in between his explanations of being mocked is something he understands about Socrates, who's accused of inventing gods, and that he doesn't acknowledge the old ones. He says it's no doubt because of your daemonic sign comes to you on each occasion. Socrates supposedly had this daemonic sign that would come to him and tell him to doubt certain things. And whenever he was doing something that he should doubt or that was wrong, he would consult this daemon and it would tell him it was wrong. It's almost a pseudo-conscience as a concept. And maybe something more or less than that. And this intuition of morality and knowledge seems to be problematic for the state-sponsored religion. Because you can easily bring somebody up on an indictment of impiety. And this is a special court that deals with impiety matters and murder. Very specific things, and it has to do with its delineation from the aristocratic classes that proceeded in the ruling of Athens before there was the Athenian democracy, which again was only about a third of the population, which is a sixth, but there you go. Again, Socrates makes the argument that he doesn't charge a fee for his teachings. And Socrates plays devil's advocate. And I say that again because it seems like Euthyphro is really making a courageous stand here, actually doing something morally courageous. But Socrates says, I don't know, if everybody tells you what you're doing's a bad idea, maybe they're right. Maybe they have a reason for saying that. Your mom can't be happy, your brothers and sisters can't be happy, your dad's probably not happy about you indicting him for murder. So he then, kind of makes a little joke about how Euthyphro does not make himself available to teach people, and kind of ties the thread to link Euthyphro's case to his case. There's obviously the parallel of, here's a man who stands before this court and actually, who knows if he speaks tongues or just kind of rambles on, but makes predictions and communes with the gods in a way that makes concrete statements about them, that says something about their character, that speaks to their ontology, if you will. Because if he does this and the gods respond to it or are happy with it, that says something specific about the gods, and you could make argumentations out of that. So here's this man versus the guy Socrates, who presumably just asks questions and doesn't so much say that he doubts the gods, but causes other people to have doubt in him. And so here's this man, morally courageous, very devout, thinks that he has religion or the world figured out. Thinks he has the gods figured out. So you can teach me about piety, and I'll then go tell everybody else what piety is. And I'll be corrected. I'll never go astray again. And so he kind of ropes them into the same camp. And Socrates will agree with people, again, stroke their ego, and it's a characterized play. But it's showing this way where he butters them up and then challenges them based upon this inflated ego that he's now given them. And so, big man making a huge moral, courageous step here, prosecuting his own father. You must really know who the gods are and what they want. And so if you teach me, I'll say to my accuser, look at this guy. Look at Euthyphro, who's so pious that he's even gone against his own father to pursue the will of the gods. So if you can plead your case, I should definitely be able to plead my case. And if you who's, put your money where your mouth is, if you're so sure of yourself, then surely you can teach me what brought you to that certainty, and I can plead my case upon the same grounds. And they should, if they're going to come after me, they should come after you, right? And of course, Euthyphro says, yeah, if he brought something against me, I'd find his weak spots immediately, and I'd make quick work of him. So now we see how Socrates has gotten them on the same side here. So he asks him, would you teach me what is piety and what is impiety? And he says, well, what I'm doing right now is pious. I'm doing the right thing even though everybody else is telling me to do the wrong thing. And it's actually not a bad definition or a working start. And then Socrates tries to nail this down. Says, you see, those very people acknowledge Zeus as the best and most just of the gods, and yet they agree that he puts his own father in fetters because he unjustly swallows down his children, and that he, in his turn, castrated his father because of one similar injustice. He brings up the parallel of Zeus, who, for all intents and purposes, killed his father for eating his brothers and sisters. Kronos is the god of time, and he eats his children. He was the father of Zeus and all of the other gods. And so he draws that parallel, and again, we're already stuck into the mythology of it. And so our character, Socrates, mythological himself as he is now the avatar that fights the mysticism of previous philosophies and the mysticism of the current culture. And so, in casual conversation, Euthyphro kind of throws an answer back at Socrates and says, yeah, I can teach you this and a lot of other things. And Socrates says, yeah, I wouldn't be surprised that you could tell me more things, but you didn't tell me what is pious and what isn't pious. You've given me a specific instance of something that is pious, this action, but I didn't ask you to teach me about one or two of the many pieties, but rather the form itself, by virtue of which all the pieties are pious. He asked him to teach him about piety, not the circumstances of a particular action being pious. He wants to know the quality by which he can measure all other actions to find if they're pious. And this is an important distinction, and again, it's theatrical, and the character Euthyphro is not expecting this. Usually, especially in Athens, especially with a pantheon and a state-sponsored religion, you can throw out gobbledygook as an answer and people will accept it. Even without those things, you can throw out gobbledygook as an answer and people will accept it. You can just rationalize. And so, using the Socratic method, he's not allowing this rationalization to take place. He's specifically picking apart the explanations to try and derive at something that is universally true. So they arrive on this definition of what is loved by the gods. Euthyphro says, in that case, if that's what you want me to teach you about piety, what's loved by the gods is pious, and what is not loved by the gods is impious. And they've already talked a little bit about the war of the gods brought about by Zeus slaying his father and other complications. And now he talks about conflicts between the gods. Some things are God loved, some things are God hated. And there are disagreements amongst the gods. And so there are things that certain gods love and certain gods don't. For instance, Kronos certainly didn't love being murdered by or killed or castrated by his son. And Kronos' children certainly didn't appreciate being swallowed whole. And he brings up other examples which knowledge of the mythology helps with. And so Socrates questions him some more and then asks him a more direct question about qualitative distinctions. He asks him specifically, if we were arguing about the weight of an object, I'll just say a pumpkin. We were arguing about the weight of of two pumpkins. We just measure them and see which one weighed more. We wouldn't actually get angry about what the answer was. We wouldn't argue or fight. We would just go straight to weighing it. Same with any other qualitative distinction that you can make. And so this is illuminating this idea, which isn't unfamiliar to most people of Western civilizations, but was a pretty new idea, is the universality of certain qualities, and having actual methods and precise ways of talking about things that can allow us to come to an established truth, even about very difficult things like piety. And, of course, Euthyphro is just straw man answering, yes, that's right, even contradicting himself, which happens a lot in these dialogues. And they bring up, back to the issue of God loved and God hated, the idea of course, Zeus not making another god, his father, happy by killing him. Hera and one of her sons, Hephaestus, had a particularly nasty interchange with one another and did things that made themselves happy, but not the other one. Hephaestus was ugly and banished from Mount Olympus, which didn't make him very happy, but made his mom happy. And so this is an argument about the problems inherent in marrying mythological religion to actual issues of morality, to actual practice of morality, ethics, law, justice, civics. Because you have the perfect person to ask here, somebody who communes with the gods. What is pious? How do we judge our actions? And the best he can come up with is what's God loved and God hated. And of course, the argument immediately falls apart, because there's gods do fight with each other and do things all the time that aren't God loved and God hated. And so the certain gods love certain things that other gods hate, and the two things are not mutually exclusive. And so then they, of course, come down to the line of argumentation about the distinction between judging actions. And Socrates says, well, what about men, Euthyphro? Have you never heard them arguing that someone has killed unjustly or done anything else unjustly should not be punished. He's making the argument, have you ever heard somebody say, I'm guilty of the crime, but I shouldn't be punished? Or people shouldn't be punished whenever they do something improper. Instead, they actually argue over whether what happened was improper or not. Whether in this case, the murder was unjust. So, Socrates says, so isn't just anything... Euthyphro has claimed that men will say or do anything to get out of having to deal with justice. Socrates says, so it isn't just anything that they'll do or say. You see, I don't think they dare say or argue that if they act unjustly, they should not be punished. Instead, I think they deny acting unjustly, don't they? This is a really excellent epistemological point about evil and intentions and how people view themselves. Nobody wants to be a bad guy or evil. You disagree about whether what they're doing is evil. And they begin discussing mutually exclusive natures. He says, Euthyphro, if indeed gods really do argue instead about actions. It is about some actions that they differ, and some of them saying that it was done justly, others unjustly. Isn't that so? Come on then, my dear Euthyphro, and teach me too, that I may become wiser. And he again throws back the case that's in front of him in his face, because now he's brought up the case of mutual exclusivity of, is what is just as injustice always pious? And, of course, this differs from their previous definition, which we can now see as a very low-resolution conversation about piety and morality. Where before they were talking about God loved and God hated, and Socrates brought up how the two are not mutually exclusive. There are some things that are both loved and hated by the gods. And so now we've arrived at a point where there's something that isn't mutually exclusive. Insofar as something is just, it is pious. And actions that do not partake in piety do not partake in justice either. And Socrates throws his case back in his face about him charging his father with murder, and again praising him for it, which we've already pointed out is at least somewhat courageous. And so, if you're gonna do all of this, and you're so wise, certainly you could teach me about this piety. Egging him on. And so Socrates then makes a concession that he'll just call this action of Euthyphro's father murdering this laborer, that action by his father was hated by all the gods, so it's impious. And Socrates brings up a good point about examining argumentation. It's fine, Euthyphro, if you just want to say that the gods think what you're doing is pious. But are we to just believe what is said, or should we question it and try and find out what the truth is? And Euthyphro says, we're going to examine it. However, I, for my part, think what was said is true. And so Socrates responds, "Soon, my good friend, will be better able to tell. Consider the following. Is the pious loved by the gods because it's pious, or pious because it's loved?" This enters into a very confusing part of the dialogue, where Socrates tries to tease out, well, for instance, he says, there's also something that's loved, and it is different from something that's loving. He uses this metaphor of carrying and carried. There's a lot of objects that could be carried. Use some contemporary examples. Your cell phone, a candy bar, a pencil, a pack of cards. These are all things that you can carry. Now, nothing about those objects is essential to being carried, except for the fact that it is carryable. Now, if I'm carrying an object, it's not because that object is carryable, although that has something to do with it. It's the fact that I'm carrying it that makes it the carried object. This gets very confusing, and I'm sure I'm not helping matters anymore here. Allow me to go a little bit further, though. Here's the really confusing part that Socrates gets into. Socrates, so it's not seen because it's a seen thing. On the contrary, it's a seen thing because it's seen. Nor is it because it's a led thing that it's led. Rather, it's because it's led that it's a led thing. Nor is something carried because it's a carried thing. Rather, it's a carried thing because it's carried. And so, what Socrates is actually getting at here is there something about certain actions that partakes in this thing called piety that makes the gods love it? Not that it's circumstantial that the gods happen to love an action that makes it pious, because as we've already discovered, the gods love and hate different things. So it's only the things that all the gods love that are pious, and it's only the things that all the gods hate that are impious. And so Socrates is now making the case that piety is actually the supreme principle there. That the gods loving certain actions don't make them pious actions. That actions that show themselves to be pious are loved by the gods. This is an absolute refutation of the religious system. This is saying that there are principles that the gods appreciate. And whenever you have a polytheism, state-sponsored religion like this, you can't have, and this is why Socrates is accused of inventing gods. You can't have superordinate principles to the gods. But the society clearly does already. It already thinks that law is better than no law and that court is better than no court. They've already made qualitative distinctions, and Socrates, the character, is pointing this out. They have already stepped away from the mysticism and have started having legal tradition instead of natural justice. And so the society, this is the argument, should be shifting towards orienting itself towards the principle of piety rather than towards pleasing the gods. But this is a very clever way to do this and to maybe not be called out for impiety or sacrilegiousness. So it's a very complicated, very complex argument to tease out something that we already have a great deal of familiarity with. That there are superordinate principles to things, A. and B, that there are universal that there are universal concepts that particular instances participate to varying degrees. Meaning, oh, well, that was a good thing that person did, but we actually know that it could have been a better thing. They could have behaved better. They could have produced more product. However you want to look at it. We have superordinate principles that do not rely on artistic, mystic interpretations. This is going on pretty long, so I'm going to try and speed through some of the rest of this. So the whole, it's not a scene, it's a led thing, it's not a carried, it's a carry thing. He's actually trying to tease out the idea of a superordinate principle above the gods, which is sacrilegious, and you can't just come out and say that. We then get to the point where, as anyone with a sympathetic bone in their body can relate to Euthyphro with, where he just becomes frustrated that the argument won't stay down, and Socrates makes the joke about his sculpting ancestor, which I believe I did explain during the reading. You see, and here's something I did not get to last time. You see, I'd prefer her to have accounts stay put and be immovable, established for me, than to acquire the wealth of Tantalus. And I explained that Tantalus is where we get the word tantalizing. He was actually a son of Zeus. He was a demigod who had so much wealth that it, of course, corrupted him, and he actually performed an act of... He killed his son and fed his son to the gods to see if they could tell, supposedly. And they could, and they punished him by putting him in the underworld chained to a tree, and the water would be up to his chest until he stooped down to take a drink, and it would go down below where he could reach it, and the food would hang right out of the reach of his lips, and whenever he'd go to try and grab it, it would sway out of his way. That's where we get the word tantalizing. And so these mythological stories already have inherent in them moral tales and values of the society. It's very complex and vast. These aren't just, as Freud would say, not in these words, but bedtime stories to make yourself get rid of your Thanatos drive, or your fear of death. These are actually intricate, complex morality tales that do have very specific content, like cannibalism right there. Cannibalism by the gods and how it was hated by them. I mean, you would think if they were gods, they could do anything and it wouldn't really matter to them. We think of cruel and vindictive gods in our literature and fiction all the time now, and ones who don't care about humans don't seem that strange to us. But again, these are very specific moral lessons, very specific mystic traditions. So he brings it back to, teach me what is pious, Euthyphro. And Socrates then posits something himself and recites a poem that he believes in the opposite of. The poem is, with Zeus the maker, who caused all these things to come about, you will not quarrel, since where there's dread, there's shame too. He uses this to demonstrate, again, properties of universals and mutual exclusion. Where there's dread, there's shame too. The poet has said that these are mutually linked. Wherever you find dread, also you will find shame. Well, people are afraid of behaving badly, and people are afraid of improper behavior that will hurt them in the future, like not tending to their crops. People are afraid of all kinds of things that there is not shame in. And so Socrates brings that about because Euthyphro is still stuck in this problem of universals and particulars, and the seeing and the seen, and the carried and the carrying. He's still stuck in that and in the religious context. And so Socrates makes a case to him in the religious language about Zeus making things. But then, since dread and shame are both negative emotions, this poet, which is unknown, it may be indistinguishable from the precursors of philosophy that happened before this. This could be philosophy, previous philosophy, that where there's dread, there's shame too, and you could see that as they're both negative emotions, so they both must be bad. But Socrates reasons out adequately that just because there's dread, someone's afraid of something, doesn't mean that they need to feel shame because they feel dread. Because there's no shame in not wanting to mess up. You fear messing up. Well, there's no shame in not wanting to mess up. So he's using this to bring Euthyphro around. And again, he uses a mathematical example. He talks about odd numbers and even numbers. He says, you would say, for shame is part of fear, just as odd is of number. Hence, where there's a number, there isn't something odd too, but where there's something odd, there is also a number. Just because there's a number doesn't mean it's an odd number. But anywhere that there's an odd number, it is a number. And that may sound silly, but he's used several examples, and I'll kind of let the cat out of the bag early, so we're kind of just going over a lot of the same thing here now, which I feel a little bit bad about, but only a little bit. So Euthyphro says, the part of the just that's holy or pious is the one concerned with tending to the gods, while the remaining part of the just is concerned with tending to human beings. And Socrates then hones in on this, and again, the Socratic questioning has purpose, and again, this is theatrical. And remember how I said at the beginning, Athenians don't bring lawsuits. It's called an indictment. This is about Athens and justice and morality, because it is tied up in the mythology, and Socrates would be very happy if they would drop the theology and start paying homage to the real superordinate principles. And so he's gotten an answer. Socrates has gotten an answer from Euthyphro about what justice partakes in of the pious and what justice partakes in of the impious. And he says, well, whenever it relates to humans, or whenever it relates to the gods, justice is pious, because you have this principle of the good ascribed to the gods. They are good. It even says in here, they give us everything that's good about being and experience. Everything good that we have, we got from them. Which, again, Socrates isn't probably particularly happy about as the society that he lives in. So Socrates hones in on this. He says, you seem to me have put it very well, but I don't understand This tending you're talking about. That's where he hones in. This tending. Because now there's the tending to the gods. And Socrates wants to attend to the gods. Just not the way that Athens would probably appreciate. He wants to take care of them right and quick. And he says, because horse training is expertise in tending to horses, cattle breeding, expert in tending to cattle, all of these things, dogs, tending to dogs. And so, again, using these logical principles, do you think that tending aims to harm what's being tended? Euthyphro says, no, by Zeus, I don't, which I don't know. I mean, a lot of by Zeus's slip by the censors in these books. I'm just saying, like, if you're supposed to be, it sounds like just using his name in vain. Which I don't mind. Sometimes I say by Zeus just because I think it's hilarious because I've read a lot of Plato. But to them, yeah, anyway. So Socrates now asks, what sort of tending to the gods would the pious be? Because now we're actually talking about what he wants to talk about. We're talking about man's relationship to the gods. Because again, there's the ontology of, do the gods exist? Or do these principles exist? And we just kind of mediate them between the gods. And they don't have a specific language to talk about this yet that we later developed in the Western world because of these dialogues. And so, he uses reason to say, well, tending is used to help. So now that you've made this claim about tending to the gods, this has to benefit the gods. This tending that you're discussing must benefit the gods. And then they kind of tease out what this character is. He says, But it is why I asked what you did mean by tending to the gods, because I didn't think you meant that sort of tending. Talking about making the gods better, because if you tend a horse, if you're good at taking care of horses, the horse is better for it. And so if we humans could make the gods better, then you might as well be inventing your own gods and might as well be sacrilegious. So he says, no, by Zeus, I wouldn't say that we make the gods better by tending to them, the word that he used. He says, I didn't think you meant that sort of tending. He says, well, you were right. He says, well, then what sort of tending would the pious be? Euthyphro says, the very sort of tending, Socrates, that slaves provide to their masters. He says, I understand it would be some sort of service to the god. And now Socrates is actually, before he let Euthyphro pull out enough rope to hang himself, because Euthyphro brought up the tending. He says, okay, so now we're talking about actually interacting with the gods. This is great. This is what I wanted to talk about. And then he actually throws out the next word, which he's terrible for doing. Straw manning all over the place. He says, then it would be some sort of service. Because that's the type of tending that slaves would do to their masters. And so then we have this idea of service to the gods, not tending to the gods, not making them better. It's a type of service to the gods. And how do we contextualize the word service in our language? What about a ship service? What kind of service do shipbuilders do? Well, they produce ships. What kind of service is provided? What is the purpose of the process? Socrates says, then tell me, good friend, what result does service to the gods aim? Clearly you know, since you say you have a finer knowledge on the matter than other human beings. He's, again, a prophet. He speaks the truth of the gods in prophecy. He says, what do the gods produce by using our services? You use a slave services to produce product. As Abraham Lincoln said, you work, I eat. The product is the food for the master. And Euthyphro says, they produce many fine ones, Socrates. And Socrates, frustrated, as Euthyphro obviously is as well. So too do generals, my friend. Nonetheless, you could easily tell me the main one, which is to produce victory in war, is it not? And farmers to produce food from the earth. So why can't you tell me the main thing? And this is what he always charges people with, is you tell me all of these particular instances. I want to know the actual principle that points to all of those things, that I wouldn't need to come and ask you about every single action. I wouldn't need to come and ask you about every specific instance if you'd tell me what principle guides the actual labeling. Says, so you could, don't just tell me that it produces a lot of fine things that are service to the gods. Tell me the main things that it produces. And Euthyphro says, I told you a moment ago, Socrates, it's a pretty difficult task to learn about all these matters, but simply a person who knows how to do and say the things that are pleasing to the gods in prayer and sacrifice are the ones that are pious. And that's actually a really powerful sentence. And I think Socrates, Plato actually knows this, but they can't yet divorce sacrifice and prayer from the theology, because we all know the benefits of delayed gratification. And we all know the sacrifices we make for our loved ones or our passions or our families. And so sacrifice isn't a necessarily foreign idea even to us today. But Socrates won't divorce this, and so he picks up on that and says, if you wanted to, you could have put the main point I asked about much more briefly. If you'd given the answer, I'd already know about piety. But once again, what are you saying that the pious or piety is? Didn't you say that it was some sort of knowledge of sacrifice and praying? He says, yes, I did. Socrates, and sacrificing is giving to the gods and praying is asking from them. And so he then says this is a type of exchange then. We ask things through prayer and then we give things through sacrifice. So it's an exchange with the gods. Euthyphro says, yes, trading, if that's what you prefer to call it. Socrates says, I don't prefer anything if it isn't true. But tell me, what benefit do the gods get from the gifts they receive from us? Again, how do we make them better? And he's constantly he's tempting people with, all you have to do is say that the gods aren't real and this is ridiculous. And I'll go away. I'll stop bugging you. I'll stop asking you questions. I'll stop making you feel unsure about the things that you want to just take for granted and feel sure about. All you have to do is make the claim that I want to make, that this is all false. And we know it. And we actually are really good at picking out the parts that aren't fake and doing our lives according to that. We're actually pretty good at it, and we need to focus on that more, but we can't as long as it's sacrilege to say the thing that you can't say to me, because I'll go away if you just say, well, this whole God business is probably not productive for all of these other societal things that we're trying to do. But they can't say that. Not only do they believe, but they also think Socrates is goading them. And Socrates has a reputation of being a rabble-rouser. And so they don't want to just... Anyway. Perhaps I'm reading too much into it. But however, it's pretty easy to get that from his constant challenging of the religious system, and the fact that his goal seems to be to draw out superordinate principles to the gods, which make the gods themselves irrelevant. As a pantheon. I think it's slightly different from monotheism, but I don't intend to talk about that right now. And so Euthyphro says, but Socrates, do you really think the gods are benefited by what they receive from us? He says, if not, then what could our gifts be to them? He says, well, it's pleasing, it's honor and reverence. He says, so is the pious pleasing to the gods, Euthyphro, but not beneficial to them or loved by them? And he says, no, in fact, I think it's most loved of all. He says, so once again, it seems he draws the argument exactly back to where it was, which is pretty much how most Socratic dialogues end, with them exactly back on the first premise that they were at. Because, first of all, people in these dialogues tend to just agree with him, which ends up running the logic in circles, because he's getting them to agree with a counter position to what they just said. And so, but this is really the crux of the argument. So, is the pious pleasing to the gods? We'll go over this one. If not, Euthyphro, what could those gifts of ours to the gods possibly be? And Euthyphro says, what else do you think but honor and reverence? And, as I said just now, what's pleasing to them? So what value do they get of the sacrifice? And he's like, so, is the pious pleasing to the gods? If we behave piously, if this honor and reverence takes the form of piety, is that beneficial to them or loved by them? And he says, no, I think it's the most loved of all thing, because to say that we could benefit the gods or make the gods better is now manufacturing gods. It's being sacrilegious, it's being impious. And so they then arrive exactly back where they were. And Socrates, well, if you say that, can you wonder why your count seemed to not stay put, but to move around? And then either we weren't right to agree before, or we were right, or if we were right, our present suggestion is wrong, which is him getting to the point of this superordinate principle, because he's trying to get him to say something other than, so is it pious pleasing to the gods, but not beneficial to them or loved by them? He says, no, it's loved, because that's his belief. This is his belief system that's being challenged. He could not enter into the logical trap and say, no, it is beneficial to them. It does benefit the gods. And Socrates, this might not even be sacrilegious. It might just be, the argument, the place that Socrates or Plato wants to take the argument. The argument being that insofar as actions partake in being pious, an action that is pious, by being pious, makes the gods have to love it. The gods would not be good if they didn't love what was pious. And so the gods loving it has literally nothing to do with it being pious. It being pious is something that it achieves on its own, and because of that, the gods are pleased by it, because they're good. But that negates the reason for the gods. The gods are not the source of it. There is a source of piety that the gods are subordinate to. That's the real argument. But he gets stuck back in the trap, because it's a tragic play, and Socrates is doomed to take his own life by order of the court of Athens. And so Socrates says, again, teases him about, if you didn't know what pious and impious was, you never would have ventured to prosecute your own father for murder on behalf of a day laborer. On the contrary, you wouldn't have risked acting wrongly because you'd have been afraid before the gods and ashamed before men. As things stand, however, I well know that you think you have full, clear knowledge of what's pious and what isn't. So tell me what you think it is, my excellent Euthyphro, and don't conceal it. Euthyphro quickly makes up an excuse as why he has to leave. Good move. Socrates is left lamenting that if he'd only just told him what piety was, he could have escaped this prosecution that's about to happen to him. Which is, of course, pointing out that, again, it's performative. Socrates is a man who's put everything on the line. He's already decided to let himself be killed because he believes in reason enough. He believes in what he's doing enough. He believes in his solution to the corruption, the sophist corruption enough, and to the corruption of the state in general. And he sees superordinate principles above what the mythology will allow the common people of the state, even the citizens, even the voting 1/6 of Athens, to draw near to. He's a big proponent of piety. He just doesn't think it should be mediated through the machinations of the mythologies. And so somebody with such dedication then meets somebody else who seems to have great dedication and have put a great deal of thought and is doing something very morally courageous. But it's a story, and it's performative. So this person's supposed to be very attractive to us morally, but whenever questioned, as he should be, about this big claim that he's making that is so foreign or contrary to the most popular beliefs of, his family, Socrates is saying, okay, so you're doing this and risk being hated by people, but your father might actually die. And I'm not going to just let you off the hook or treat you with kid gloves. I'm going to ask you what makes you think you know so much about piety, about what being good is, that you'll do this. And maybe he's right. Socrates doesn't really let us know what he thinks about that, and he might actually think he is right and that it is morally courageous. But Socrates is also doing something morally courageous, and it's in the background and it's not even talked about, and that is he has already decided to die instead of flee. Or he's going to decide to die instead of flee, and die for what he believes in. And here's another man doing the exact same thing, but without reason upon questioning. That was our first explanation, and the next one won't be nearly as long because I won't have to go over the history of Athens. I'm so happy for anyone who stuck around and listened to that, and I'd love to hear back from all of you. Thank you all very much for listening, and God bless each and every one of you. Good night.